this time. It's really a privilege to be able to welcome Mr. David Cherrett to speak to us tonight. Whom I actually met while working with Mr. Thomas Streeter. So David studied history when at Oxford. He's had an esteemed 25-year career within commodity as well as power markets. So ladies and gentlemen, please give David a very warm welcome.
But actually, if I may, I'd like to thank you for something more than a round of applause. I'd actually like to thank you for this opportunity because, as Alex said, I've been working in commodity markets as an analyst, with lots of presentations, but I'm usually talking to traders or analysts, and our focus is on the supply and demand of any commodity and the price signals from it to resolve the imbalances of supply and demand. So price is just a signal to move areas of surplus to areas of deficit. And we've become very granular, very narrow-minded, thinking about the problems and what the possible solvers are, and price is the tell and signal that will trigger those responses. In the course of that, of course, one notices certain things, certain asides, which then feed back into one's worldview. They're rarely things that you have the audience or indeed the interest to discuss in a trading environment. So to come here to the society, the energy society, and have an opportunity to share some ideas with you is actually a privilege for me. I've really been looking forward to this. And I want to make it very clear that this is not a lecture. It's not a formed, cohesive thesis that you should take away and go, oh, I'm going to quote that. This is really a musing of a market practitioner who has observed price and observed flows of molecules and electrons globally for a number of years, and consideration from that of ways we look at some of the problems today and some of the challenges. Because what I'm increasingly sensing and noticing is a disconnect between price signal and some of the noise that we receive around the challenges that we're facing. And so it's really that I wanted to look at. And so on reflection, if you forgive me, if the committee will allow me, I slightly altered the title of the paper piece into Economics, Ethics and Energy Markets. And the reason I wanted to do that is I'm going to take what's happened in the European energy markets over the last 18 months, really as a case study. And from that, we'll break it down and see if there are any more broad themes that maybe we could take to consider as frames of reference around the bigger issues that you're doubtless being challenged with intellectually on a daily basis now. Just to be clear, to me, energy is the entire gamut of transport and heating and industrial use, and therefore it's oil and all the oil products, all the way through to electricity and its fuels. But the focus I'll actually be working around will be largely around the electricity and the fuels, the input markets. And of course, that's deliberate because so much of that is tied to a lot of discourse around climate change and policy and responses and transition, etc., etc. But many of the things I think I'll be touching on refer to the broader essence of energy, including oil. But that distinction is there, and one that we need to be aware from the beginning. Now, I wouldn't expect you to know or be watching the granular details, but doubtless from looking at the news, you've been aware that the prices of electricity and gas that goes to fuel the or produce the electricity have been very violent in the last 12 months. And whether you like it or not, if you're paying a gas bill, an electricity bill, when it lands on your door in April, it is going to be a lot higher than you're used to paying. Now, this is one of the things I want to explore, kind of what's happened, why it's happened, but then draw back and sort of say what we can take from it. These charts we use all the time in my world. Don't worry about the details. In fact, don't worry about the details in pretty much everything I show you tonight. We want to talk conceptually, but I'm going to use this kind of framework just as a hook to discuss. So what am I showing you here? Well, each line represents a different fuel type. So the yellow line, that's German power electricity prices. The purple line, that's coal prices into Europe. And the green line is gas. And the white, that's the price of a carbon credit you have to buy if you're polluting. Now, there's a thing that I think is kind of interesting about that. You don't need to be an economist or even know anything about markets to know that if this is time and this is price, the price of stuff got very violently expensive in 2021. But what I find so interesting is that the price of stuff got even more expensive than it did in 2007-8. Now, what happened in 2007-2008? The global financial crisis. You might have missed it, but it nearly was the end of the capitalist system. The modern banking system, as we know, nearly stopped in 2007. And I only exaggerate a bit. It was a very, very unstable period of economic history, financial history in particular. And what's fascinating is that the prices that we've seen in energy are more stressed. They're signaling. What does price do? It's just a signal. They're signaling greater stress last year than in the global financial crisis. Well, that's an interesting place to start. Because what it kind of suggests is we've actually had a global molecule crisis. And the evidence, again, don't worry if you can't read the details, it doesn't matter. The evidence of this is a technique we use in analytics is to look at inventory, stores of stuff, and do it in a relative basis, so percentage of demand. And if you look at pretty much every fuel type, and in every location, so the blue line is European gas, the green line is American gas, the dark blue, black is US coal, the red's Chinese coal. Doesn't matter what the fuel is, which location. Pretty much all of it in 2021 was in a massive shortage. That's in percentage, those are negative percentages year on year of inventory, massive drawdown of inventory. Never forget, inventory is simply just the balance of supply and demand. It grows when there's too much stuff, it shrinks when there's not enough. So it's a tell for how physically tight the market is. What you also note is we've never had that before. We've never had all the fuels tight at the same time. There's been the odd exception, but it's always been something that's been in a surplus, in this case Chinese coal in 2017. Why does this matter? Well, what is the job of a market? Any market. The real job of a market is to send price to a level that ensures there's sufficient supply. Now, if there's not enough stuff, the price goes up to do one of two things. To either attract new supply or to stop demand. Most of us don't want to do without food, water, or electricity. And so the markets that function around those, the food markets and the electricity or fuel markets or petrol markets, pretty much always try and avoid or go to a point that you can avoid demand destruction. You don't want to be cold. I live up in the Peak District, and I was in the Peak District about a month ago, when Storm, I can't remember what it's called, Storm Arlene or something came in, and it took down a number of transmitters, and as a result, we were without power in our village for 4 days. The water system went off after the second day, and it's never happened in the lifetime of anyone living in the village. The first day, it was really exciting. By day 2, this is absolutely true, in the kitchen of the cottage, I had the fridge open to keep it cool. It was so cold. I kept my food cold in the fridge by keeping the door open. I had one room and I had a log fire that I kept going, and we stayed in that room. Now, that experience was a sanitary reminder of how essential these essential services really are, and why getting the service of energy right isn't a luxury. It is actually at the heart of what it is to live in a modern society and to step away from a world where death is very much part of everyday life. So when people talk about energy, it is not a luxury or an abstract. It is an essence of being a living, healthy human being today. And it's something that everyone has a right to aspire to. I think that is an interesting point, because when you look at this, what is this actually saying? What this is actually saying is, remember what markets do? If I've got a shortage of stuff, I go to a price to attract another molecule. Well, if there's a shortage of gas in Europe, gas price goes up in Europe, so I get the gas from Asia. But if there's a shortage of gas everywhere, I can't get any more gas. But don't worry, what I'll do, I'll get some coal in, and we'll burn coal to offset the loss of gas. Hang on a second. I can't, there isn't any coal. What are you going to do? There's only one thing you can do. That's destroy demand, which is to turn off people's heating, in essence. Now, we never got to that because systems and grids are so developed, so sophisticated that we can manage things slightly differently. But that isn't my point. My point is we shouldn't be anywhere near here. And this is really kind of, once we start thinking about energy on these terms, then a lot of the discourse around how we set up our energy system starts to look to me slightly different. Why did we have a gas crisis, a shortage of gas in Europe? Well, Aristotle talks about different types of causation, and actually, without sounding too pompous, it's quite useful, some of his categories of causation, when we ask the question, what causes a thing? Because I don't know, it wouldn't be a fair question, but if I asked you what caused the gas shortage, if you happen to know it by reading the press, my bet is, I'm not going to embarrass you by asking you, my bet is you'd probably say, no, it's the Russians, shortage of Russian gas. That's probably, I'm guessing, would be the answer, because that's what the newspapers are full of. And I want to just talk a little bit about that. The first thing, let's talk about material cause. Well, when you talk about the European gas market, there's 3 main sources of supply. We've got them up here. So the two bigger ones are the Russians and the Scandinavian Norwegian gas fields, the North Sea gas, you've heard of that. Then there's this LNG, the shipped gas, liquid nitrogen gas, natural gas rather, which comes in big boats into our terminals. Now the trend very clearly has been rising imported gas by ships and a gradual decline, just stabling off of the other two. The thing to really notice, however, is let's go to 2021. What was the most marked decline? It wasn't the Russians. We've had a very sharp reduction in supplies for various reasons in the last couple of months. But look, it's LNG. It was imported gas, most of it having to go to Asia rather than coming here. That was the real physical decline. So actually, if you wanted a material cause, it was actually shipped gas, not Russian gas. Is the first thing just to posit. But this ship gas is an interesting one because one of the things that's happened here is that the structure of the global gas market has changed. Back in the day, when they set up the grids here in the UK and imported gas, gas operated on a series of regional procurement markets. And all that means is, if you're in Europe, you get your gas from the North Sea, you import it, you consume it, that's it. It doesn't matter what's happening in America, it doesn't matter what's happening in China. That's all changed because of LNG, because you can ship the stuff around. And so what's happened is that now people start, I'll show you in a moment, but now the gas will just move wherever the demand is. And where's the demand? Well, it's this orange blob that's been growing and growing. This is Chinese gas demand. China's got two very, very, very good reasons to import their gas, apart from the fact they haven't got much of their own. The first one is their economy is growing very rapidly, and yet they don't consume enormous amounts of energy. I think it's something like 80 gigajoules per capita. Compare that to the States, about 300. So they're very much on a growth consumption phase of energy, quite right too, nothing wrong with that. LNG brings them gas and it moves away from dirty coal, which is causing enormous amounts of smog pollution to them. Makes a lot of sense. So completely understandable. The thing is, China's enormous, as you probably noticed, and we can turn to our experts in the room for confirmation of that. But that enormity is on a scale that blows out any of the classical models for supply and demand in old markets. So to give you an example, in Europe, the biggest LNG importer is the Spanish. I think that's right, but they're a big, major importer of LNG. Chinese LNG imports grew over the last 18 months by more than the entirety of Spanish imports. So, as an analyst, if I believe that, as was drilled into me, that price is always made at the margin, which means it's the marginal change of supply and demand that will determine the price. What's going to be at the margin determining the price of gas? Of course, it's going to be Chinese behaviour. So you might think you sat here as a European utility or a man or woman at home consuming, turning your gas on. You might think what matters to you is the temperature here in Oxford. Actually, what matters is the temperature of Beijing. That's new. That's globalization in action. But what it means is we're exposed very much now to global gas prices. And you can see it here. Don't worry about the details, just look at what happened in gas prices. These are different regional gas prices up to 2018. This is the start of the major push-out, build-out in LNG. Suddenly all the prices start aligning. Of course they do, it's arbitrage, it's markets, it's what they do. And they've got a mechanism to arbitrage now through LNG. So LNG was a massive thing, but it wasn't the only thing. If you want material causes for what's happened. This is the LNG shipments. You can see them falling down. Now, yeah, Russian flows, there's issues around it. I'm not going to get into the politics of it all. But actually, whilst we've not had surpluses of gas from Russia, a couple of things. It's been really cold in Moscow. Russian domestic gas prices suggest that. So they've got issues themselves. But either way, the flows are constrained, but they've met all their contract obligations. But there's been other things. North African flows, they were disrupted because of the political tension between Morocco and Algeria. There's been trouble with Norwegian flows. We decided to close down a load of our storage, making our systems more fragile. And the Dutch, who have a very major system, have also been going through closure. So there's been other things as well. These are material causes. But so far, it's all fairly constrained, is it not? I mean, nonetheless, it caused a big problem. Because as of a couple of months ago, this is an older forecast, but as of a couple of months ago, these lines which represent how much gas there's left in storage at the end of the season, we've gone to zero. We didn't think there'd be any gas left. So that's when price goes parabolic, so governments turn off the switch and close down industry. Now, we've had some voluntary closures of industry, you might have heard of that, and zinc manufacturers and fertilizer companies. And what's that going to do? What's the price of grain going to be next year? Nitrogen crop prices have gone parabolic. So the price of food is going to go up worldwide because of an energy shock. But fortunately, markets have done a good job in attracting molecules and we've solved the problem short term. Great. So that's what happened if you want a material cause. But let's dig a bit deeper and say, well, why did it happen now? Why in 2021? I think you need to disassociate. No, you need to separate this into two distinct arguments of causation. One is the short-term cyclical cycle change. The other is a secular investment trend. We're going to talk about both of them briefly for you. Well, the first one is a cyclical bull market in commodities and demand for energy as a result. Why did this happen? Well, the simple answer is COVID. Now, COVID is a really interesting one as a market analyst because whilst superficially it might appear the key issue was a virological one about virus, actually for us as analysts, in the context of discussing supply and demand, far more significant was government policy. Now, the reason I say this is effectively the only time we've seen a collapse in economic activity like we saw last year was in war, and particularly the Second World War is a very good example. And why does it happen? Because it's the only time governments come in and mandate the economy to behave differently. They say, stop making that useful stuff, go and build some guns instead. Now, they do it for a very, very good reason, but nonetheless, the useful stuff stops getting built. The economic activity collapses, other stuff starts happening. Effectively, that's it. Now, what is that? That is a supply-side shock. Now, you don't have to be an economist, and I'm not going to go into details of it, but effectively, a supply-side shock is really sudden. It's when you turn the economy off. Demand-side shocks, like we had in the global financial crisis, are different. That's when you and I go, whoa, I don't want to buy anything, for whatever reason. Now, when the key difference is a supply-side shock. How many of you wanted to go on holiday last year? I did. How many of you actually managed to get on a plane and go? Right, that's a supply-side shock. If I said to you now, you can go, there's the money, if you can go, how many of you would go? Of course, we'd all go, right? Now, that's what happens in a supply-side shock. And that is, if you think I'm kidding, look at this. This is the white line. This is Chinese electricity consumption. Why China? China's the world's factory, 40% of the world GDP. China's industrial production just exploded in 2021 as we came out of lockdowns and you and I went running out to go and buy stuff. And so their electricity consumption, all the way really from the closure, the end of their lockdown, but particularly in 2021, we saw an enormous spike in energy consumption in China out of this, in response to this supply side response. This is the cyclical rally. What did this do? Well, every commodity on earth, bar a couple, exploded higher through 2020 into 21. This again is typical of a post-supply side shock. This is a cyclical squeeze, if you like. Perfectly natural. So you might be sitting here in the Energy Society going, well, that's not very interesting. What on earth has this got to do with my interest? Well, the problem is, this isn't the only thing that's going on. There's something far more sinister as well in terms of our discussion. And that is, this is the white line of energy consumption. What's this blue line? This is Chinese coal production. Now remember, China has a energy system reliant on coal. Coal production, for a whole host of reasons, has not really moved in China. Use that as in the glibest way, but effectively, they're under similar pressures to in the West for investment in coal. Not quite the same, there are differences. But this gap had to be filled, and what's it going to be filled with? If they're no longer able to rely on their own natural supplies of energy, of course they'll import, and they're importing enormous amounts of LNG as a result. This should be our first warning sign of a signal that is not optimal. Because you see, there's been something else going on here, which is alongside this cyclical bull market, there is a secular or structural supply side tightness in the primary energy fuels which lie at the heart of our energy system, which lies at the heart of a functioning society. I'm making no moral ethical judgments on the rightness or wrongness of carbon-based fuel. What I'm making is an observation as an analyst that our investment cycle from about the early part of 2000s skewed really violently to a massive investment in renewables and a collapsed investment in primary energy. Now, when I say primary energy, this is not oil. This is coal, gas, particularly coal. Now, you may say, well, that's got to be good because it's less pollution. But the problem is, all acts have unintended consequences, and the unintended consequence here is that we've created a global squeeze of our primary energy. Goldman Sachs used the phrase, they're talking of it in a different context to I am, but they call it the revenge of the old economy. They're talking about effectively money policy, how the Federal Reserve banks have been artificially suppressing interest rates and how that's altered investment behaviour, and that's a related issue. But it's a really nice phrase. The old economy, the real economy, has been underinvested in, and that includes the primary energies. Now, for whatever reason, I'm not passing the moral judgment, but there are consequences. Because this has happened, just as our dependency, it's happened just as our dependency, rather, here in the West, on gas in particular, has risen. Now, it's done that for two reasons. The first is, and this is the UK, but I could have shown you Spain, Germany, pretty much, they're all pretty much the same, just this is a better chart. Coal is the white area. See, coal in the UK power mix has dramatically declined. Must be a great thing, right? Less carbon emissions. But at the same time, we've had a massive increase in renewables and a big increase in the use of gas. Now, why would you do that? Why can't we still have renewables? You may all be familiar with this, but the challenge with renewables is primarily what we call intermittency. Now, what that means is, how does a solar panel system work at night? Anyone know? You do, actually. It doesn't. Okay, and there's sun. How does the wind turbine work when the wind's not blowing? It doesn't. Of course, people try and find ways around that using battery technology. But the trouble there is we haven't yet established a means of efficiently storing power on any scale for any duration, compared to the size of our energy needs. So we'll come back to this issue of intermittency. If you have days when it is really cold and the wind's not blowing, like in Derbyshire in about January this year, when there's a high pressure front, then you cannot rely on wind turbines to produce your electricity. So what do you need? You need gas, or thank goodness we have coal stations still running because they provided some of that. We need to deal with issues around this intermittency. But there's another issue which I think is a really interesting one, a bit geeky, less directly relevant, but one of the ways system operators manage a grid is, because most grids historically ran on turbines, your coal-fired power station, it turns around. You've probably all been on an aeroplane, luxury of the West, because of the amazing explosion in cheap energy we've enjoyed for the last 100 years. When you come up to the gate, the captain turns off the engines, what happens to the turbine? Keeps going. Now, that generates still electricity to the power station. So if you turn one of those power stations off, it still has electricity, which can be used in the system. And that gives a few seconds for a grid operator to balance. Now, what happens when you turn the battery or the switch off on that? Obviously, it will run a battery, I know. But if the battery dies, what happens to that? It turns off, right? Instant. So the absence of inertia, as it's called, also creates a challenge for grid operators. So you've got intermittency, and then you've got inertia, which means you've created a system by definition that is less robust than the one that came before. Well, you've actually created a fragile system. you may have heard of Nassim Taleb and his work about fragility, and something fascinating, but if you haven't read it, I recommend it. I do find it interesting, though, that this whole concept of creating a system willfully that's more fragile than the one that came before, however well-meaning. Now, one of the reasons is that at no point is there ever any discourse about the quality of energy. The only time you ever hear any discussion about quality is quality of air. I'm not dismissing its importance, I'm just saying that's the only time I've ever heard anybody talk about quality in an energy conversation. Have you ever thought about energy quality? How could you have different type qualities of energy? A joule is a joule, right? I mean, electricity, yeah. However, think of it a bit like this. Coal is solar energy plus chemical process. It's the original solar energy. Sun comes down, plant goes, grows, gets CO2, takes, you know, stuff. So we use solar energy, but we've used it historically in a far more magnified, amplified form with the chemical process. I think it's a really interesting way to think of it. The chemical capital invested in that lump of coal is the solar plus 300 million years of chemical reaction, which you're replacing with the sun today. You've got to do a lot of work to make up for those 300 million years of lost energy, to have the same quality of energy. This isn't an abstract, it's why solar is intermittent. But once you stop talking about it in abstracts and think about it like an equation, suddenly it's like, oh, it's actually not so comfortable at all. We have taken an enormous amount of chemical capital, tossed it away, and not yet been able to replace it, which again reinforces this idea through the transition that we're effectively creating a more fragile system. And look, don't take my word for it, the market's telling you that. This dependence on this greater fragility and the greater dependence on more fragile primary energy is now manifesting itself in the price action. When we talk in markets, and we'll put my kind of trading hat, when we talk about stability of a market, the metric we use is volatility. Historical volatility, there's also a different one to that. Historical volatility, how much did price move around the mean over the last X days? Say 10 days. Well, this is it for German power prices. Now, obviously this year it's gone, but what I want you to see is really since we've embarked on the transition, isn't it interesting that the trend has very clearly been up. So I know, don't take my word for it, just can someone explain to me if it's a less fragile system, a more anti-fragile system we're creating, how come the price isn't saying that? So that kind of has me going, uncomfortably. Because the problem with all of this is it seems that you're adding systemic cost by definition. If your system, your political economic system has to be predicated on an energy system, if you make a more fragile energy system, by definition, you're creating a more fragile, expensive political economy. And again, don't take my word for it. I'm kind of interested that when I had a look. Now, this is biased, obviously, because I'm trying to find some evidence of it. But this is something I did come across, which is GDP. This is GDP per capita is the metric we use typically to talk about how productive a society is. How much economic activity, useful economic activity that can be measured does an individual produce? It's simply GDP divided by population. That's simple. But it's quite useful. And why it's useful is it bases everything if you do a few things around currencies and things. You can then say, well, okay, let's see how productive this economy is against this one. So I took the US economy, and then I took European economy, GDP per capita, and just took the European GDP per capita away from the US. So if the line's going up, it means the US is more productive. If it's going down, we're more productive. What's really striking is since the early part of 2000s, West European GDP per capita has dramatically underperformed the US. Now, I'm not so naive, as I know you're not, to mistake correlation with causation. I couldn't possibly stand here and claim, therefore, it is a result of this. My simple point is, as an analyst in energy markets, I sit down and I see tells from markets of a more fragile energy system. And now I look at economics and see signs of a more fragile economy. That has coincided with a dramatic increase in the use of renewables in the West. And you can see the share now in the EU of electricity generation has gone up to about 30% in the last 10, 12 years, whereas in the States it didn't. Really didn't, because they had really cheap energy through their share investments. That's another story. But this is a place to explore further, and I would be fascinated if people had further explanations for it. One thing we do know, we have, and this again is a given, regardless of fragility, if you mandate changes in an industry, that comes at a cost, and someone has to pay that. Ultimately, it's the taxpayer. So there's a lot of discussion about, there's parity of pricing for this thing. I don't really care about that. Show me the money. Show me the money. If it's so great, then my power bills aren't going to be high because it's great, right? I know it sounds naive, but isn't that right? Otherwise, there's something disingenuous going on. And yet, when we look at it, and I look at retail price of electricity, this isn't the market price. This isn't the stuff that I trade or get involved in. This is the stuff that you and your parents and your friends in Europe pay. There is a reasonable relationship between the penetration of renewables and the retail cost, the cost on the other side. Again, there's a tell that this transition at the moment, in the way it's being designed, is coming at a material cost. And I want to talk about this idea of cost because there are some who say, yeah, that's the kind of language I'd expect from a city markets person because you value everything in terms of money, not humanity. I really, really strongly object to that, not just because it makes me feel miserable, but because I think it's actually totally wrong. And I'm going to start with my cards on the table, my prejudices. Having worked around markets, I believe they're actually a force for, and in many cases, when they are not a monopoly and when they are not over-regulated, they can be forces for enormous good in society. An example, how many people died in the global famine in 2007? Roughly? The global famine in 2007. There wasn't one. There wasn't. There should have been, but there wasn't because of markets. Now, why should there have been? Well, the simple reason is it's being crass at one level. But what happened in 2005? The United States came out and said, we are going to mandate, we take our corn crop, which is the world's largest, pretty much at the time in terms of exports. Corn is used as animal feed. It feeds vast proportion of the world's animals. We're going to take our corn crop and we're going to turn about a third of it into ethanol to put in our engines to reduce our reliance on Middle Eastern oil. Go back to Economics 101. If you come along to a market, you've got fixed supply because you grow corn over a year, right? And you push the demand up by 30, 40%. What should happen to the price? Price should go up or down. Demand's gone screaming up, supplies have changed, price should go, yeah, right. Because, thank goodness, we have futures markets. What actually happened is when, and the Americans don't only too well, which is why they were able to do what they did, rightly so, without monstrously killing millions, because every market practitioner read that policy and went, whoa, the price of corn is going to go up. Markets responded by pushing the corn futures, not the price of corn today, the corn futures higher. So it's not the price I'm paying to actually feed my animals if I'm a buyer. It's the indication, the signal to what the farmer should do next year. So what does every farmer in Ohio do? He sits there and he goes, that's actually true, I've been in a combine in was it Ohio, one of the states in the place, and the farmer, as we were talking, had one screen here telling him the yield that was coming in through his bin, and there he had the price of Chicago Board of Trade corn futures. And he knew this field was a good representation of mean yield, and if it came in too high, he could sell futures and buy them. The point is, these are incredibly sophisticated individuals. And every one of them would have seen the corn futures price exploding. So what do? They go out, they get Jimmy, they say, you're not buying that truck. You're getting out there, you're going to dig that field, we're going to plant this field next year, because we're going to make a lot of money. So the American corn crop responded in style, enormous amount of new corn was planted, and how many people died in the global famine? None. Now, I'm not saying that the famine, but you get the point. Markets can send signals to move areas of surplus to deficit, whether that's capital, labour, or goods. Where's this brand coming from? It's coming from, if that's right, markets are forces of moral forces, which is a rather uncomfortable thing to hear, I suspect, for some people. And so I come back to my point. If the markets are signalling stress, shouldn't we pay attention to that? And the markets in energy are signaling particular stress, and that is something we should pay particular attention to. Why? Because I would argue that historically, most effective civilizations have been the function of optimal energy systems. I don't know if you guys know this individual, Joseph Tainter, is an anthropologist in the States. This book published in Cambridge Press. Collapse of Complex Society, fascinating read. It's really focused on Mayan culture, that he talks as an anthropologist across a number of cultures. And the observation he makes, which is a really powerful one, is societies collapse not because of war, not because of famine, not even because of climate change. These things will influence them enormously. But the critical unifying thing is the energy subsidies in that state reach a point where they eat into the surplus, preventing the productive class to enjoy an improved living condition. At which point, the bond that holds society together, that quote I had at the beginning, eudaimonia is Aristotle's word for well-beingness. The moment that goes, things atomize. But they're founded on an efficient energy system. It was the tiered planting of the Mayans, which allowed them to create a surplus of food, which generated wealth, which led their armies forward. The Romans, what was Roman civilization? Fundamentally, it's 80,000 kilometers of paved road that moved goods far more efficiently around the world. Even windmills, which I might have come across as being not a massive fan of the wind energy over-reliance. But make no mistake, arguably one of the most profound changes in the West in terms of imperial power came about because of wind power. And that I'll put down into the 1590s. The very first mechanical sawmills just off the coast of Amsterdam, which were wind-powered turbines, enabling the sawmills to produce loads of very effective cheap logs, which enabled the Dutch shipbuilders to create far more efficient fleets of boats, the fleets as they're called, the trading boats, creating an enormous productivity gain for the Dutch state, which is why, arguably, 30 years later, the Dutch overtake Spain. You don't have to just go, well, the Industrial Revolution, it was, the rise of coke rather than wood, a much more efficient burn. You don't have to rely just on that one example. Again and again, it's efficient energy systems that lie at the heart of efficient societies or productive societies, because they allow you to produce a surplus. Well, isn't there a corollary to that? If you make an inefficient system, by definition, you're going to create a less efficient, effective society. I find that really scary, really alarming. And it doesn't mean that you throw your hands up and you go, well, you abandon the transition, you stop. No, it doesn't. But it does mean you start a dialogue around that. And, I'm going to kind of bring this section to a close with with this. At the moment, you probably think, and understandably, that gas prices, electricity prices, that's gonna hurt me, or hurt mum and dad, or hurt someone. And that's a real pain. But I put it to you that it could be a bit more than that. Because the thing is, if I'm right about energy being at the heart of the political economy, then if you're seeing price action going to a point of stress, that's going to create unintended consequences in the broader political economy. And let's go back to our global financial crisis of 2008. Back in 2008, the real thing that happened, does anyone know what it's sometimes called in the press? It's called the credit crisis, right? You haven't heard of this phrase? Nonsense. It wasn't a credit crisis at all. It was an energy crisis. Don't take my word for it. Look at the price. So, back in 2007, oil prices, for a bunch of reasons, went to a very high level. It went to about $150 a barrel, I think it was, at some point. The oil prices, the green line, they went to the highs. As they were surging higher, it meant, because oil is used primarily as a transport fuel, it's primarily gasoline, it meant that mum and dad in America, who at the time were overextended with the credit loans, particularly around property that's taking place, suddenly aren't talking about abstracts anymore. They are having to pay highly inflated gasoline bills. And because society runs on energy in the States, that tends to be transport energy, that meant their behaviour changed and they no longer honoured their so-called ninja loans, or whatever, the no income, no job loans. And that started a cascade effect. So it was the oil price spiking, which triggered the white line collapsing. This is a credit index, so this was the credit crisis starting. And then the equity markets collapsed down, and that's the yellow line, which is the S&P. So you and I see this when the stock market collapses and the newspapers say it's Black Monday or whatever. But actually the seeds are sown in an energy crisis. And that's why I wanted to show you that chart, because look, the energy price back then, if you took all primary energy, was about 14% of global GDP because of the spike in prices. And we've pretty much got there again because of these gas prices. Now, history might not repeat itself, but it can sometimes rhyme. And isn't it interesting that just the last 6 months, what have we seen? The credit crisis. Now, this time it was in China. And it was also connected to property. And it's managed in a very different way. The Chinese economy is in a very different state or stage. So you cannot draw direct parallels. However, I do not think for one moment it is coincidental that you are starting to see financial and credit stress building when global energy prices are under pressure. And as I think I probably made clear, the contention is that part of that pressure has come because of the artificial structuring of the energy system that's taken place in the last decade. And this is a major concern. Is it contained? Maybe, certainly for now in the short term. But I'm going to leave you with this, and then I'm going to talk a bit about faith and the crisis. Don't forget, right now, gas prices have gone to something like $300 a barrel oil equivalent. I'm not at this moment, but in the highs of a month ago. And in the highs of the 2008 credit crisis, it went to about 100, oil went to 150. That should be a cause of concern for all of us, regardless whether you're an energy trader, energy specialist, simply as a human being living in a functioning society. That is a bad thing. And so I'm really interested around energy markets, but increasingly I bump into discussions around energy policy. It's not my place to comment on policy at all, but I am really interested about the way languages change in energy, and particularly demonisation, which I think is a really curious thing. And if you will forgive me, I'm going to actually ad lib a bit now about demonisation, language and energy, because it's the first time, certainly in my career for what it's worth, that I've seen the supporters of any energy system not just vilified, but it is now taboo, it seems, to talk about certain energy models. That's really striking. That's the first thing. The second thing that I find really interesting is the language of immediacy. That the crisis of global climate change, or whatever it is, however you want to couch it, is immediate. It is imminent. And the response, therefore, needs to be immediate. What I find that interesting is not least because energy system transfers historically have taken many years, even in the last, if you think back to the big change around gas, or if you had gas lamps, then you went to electricity, that transfer took many years, decades, depending whether it's Europe or the States. And yet we've not allowed that time in terms of the language in which it's couched. So imminence of the problem, I think is a really interesting one to think about. The other one is the idea of sin. That this problem has happened because of us. That we have created the conditions, and we must accept not just responsibility, but also punishment for it. But the final one of this is that because of these two preconditions, the immediacy, the imminence, and the culpability, so also that allows us to break free of traditional authority structures, whether they're language, whether they are political, whether they are energy systems. You can break these things because they are wrong. But why I found that so interesting is that behaviour is not unique in the West. We see this again and again. Now, what struck me looking at that is, my background, I was a medieval historian, studied theology. Just across the road, we used to go to lectures on it. And one of the things that was really striking about that is so much of what happened during times of heresy took place from the will, the desire to do good. But the moment you couch language around imminence, culpability, and the right to break free of traditional constraints, language, economic language, for example, that can lead you down a very different path to the one you intended to drive down. I can talk more about that, but that is why I would like to see, and I'm interested in, a greater discourse around a transition that recognises the energy benefits of primary energy and chemical capital, rather than this very binary idea that there is sin that must be exculpated immediately, because the tales are quite negative around that. And on that bombshell, the pieces are right.
How long would you be going?
I'm done. These poor people must be exhausted.
No, just wondering, so I wouldn't have mind.
No, absolutely. No, literally, that is very much just sort of, and it's a freestyle, free association music. I don't know the answers. I don't know if even that analysis is accurate. But what I do see, I see tells in markets, and I don't see the exchange of ideas around it. So I'd like to thank you once again for the opportunity to come and muse with you.
Any questions? No?
Yeah, I have a question. So you did mention that you think like the energy markets currently are efficient because they work on price signals to get rid of surplus. But I mean, like, do you not think that in itself makes it inefficient because like we do not take into account the social marginal cost of like the various I mean, like the various primary energies, or as you mentioned towards the end, like the social marginal benefits of primary sources. So without taking into account this marginal benefits and costs, don't you think it makes the free market inefficient, especially given how central energy is in everyone's lives?
Sure. Again, first comment is I don't think there are free markets in energy. I mean, they're clearly not. For example, generation, certain technologies are privileged over others, which creates all sorts of unintended consequences around investment models. Good one is coal, actually, because it's such an anathema. But at the moment, there's something like 75% of world supply is not functioning accurately. The big coal suppliers, the Colombians, even the Chinese, the Colombians, the South Africans, the Russians, the Aussies, 75% of world supply is under real stress. And do you know what the problem is in most of those cases? You no reason would. Rail cars. There are not enough rail hoppers, coal rail hoppers. And I was thinking about that going, well, what's that about? I mean, go and buy one. And that's the thing. If you run a coal business today, what possible incentive would you have to make an investment in the future? I wouldn't. Totally economically, you're being signalled not to do it. So, and there's really simple things like a lack of coal cars is creating physical tightnesses. So the first and foremost thing is I don't think it is a market in that sense. There are market prices that send signals despite the fact they're not free, because there is enough. The market does function and sending those signals. But no, it's not a pure market. Otherwise, ironically, I think what would have happened is energy prices would have gone, power prices would have gone higher much longer ago, because you wouldn't have had a huge build out of renewables because of subsidies. So you wouldn't have had no supply in certain areas. So you'd have incentivized new investment and new development. That's after all what markets do. They incentivize best cure. We have a saying in analytics that the best cure for high prices is high prices. Because if prices are high, I've got an incentive to go and do something about it. And if you really want to incentivize the creation of fusion or proper storage, surely you need prices actually to go to the point and not subsidies. Market prices. And why not? Why do I feel so uncomfortable about price subsidies? I'll tell you why. Because go back to my example, it was exaggerated for effect, but nonetheless, of 2005 to 2008, and the food policy. And make no mistake, what happened was a very profound change in the world food system. And some would argue that there was also connections right the way through to the Arab Spring and everything else. So I'm not trying to say it's quite so binary. Nonetheless, that was a dramatic example of markets being functional moral agents. Compare that with Soviets in the 1930s. Similar kind of, no, we're going to come into the food market and we're going to alter the structure of supply and demand overnight, it'll be all right. No, it wasn't. Millions and millions of people died in that famine. And that's a really important thing, I think, which is why I use that example. Because I don't think governments know more than markets. And then the reason being is unintended consequence. Markets adjust, not because the market practitioners are good people or moral agents, but the market force of price being the tell, there's a surplus here, there's a deficit here, resolve it, and greedy people coming in and resolving it, stops hungry people not getting food ultimately. So that's kind of where that bias comes from. But explore your marginal thing, because as I understand that, this comes back to this point about it's too simplistic to look just, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it's too simplistic just to look at economic gain as a source of success in a society. Is that?
Yeah, as in like, because like, I mean, like how political energy is and how like central it is to everyone's lives, there's like more to quantify rather than just price signals itself.
Yes, but are you talking about price signals as an input, or are you talking about energy as an output, because I think I still maintain if your energy system is healthy, your society is going to be healthy on a socio-economically. And you will see that in the metrics. You will see that in life expectancy, you will see that in child survival rates, and ultimately in productivity and GDP per capita. So again, this sounds good, but show me the money. You know, we've seen extraordinary transformation in society over the last 100 years, with a collapse in infant mortality, dramatic change globally, in the number of children, the education rates. That's really, factfulness. I can't remember the writer, but a wonderful, fascinating story of the education rates there. And he talks about 80% of females are now getting at least primary school education globally. This is inconceivable. And how does one of these things happen? I'm not saying, great, we'll clap ourselves in the back and go away. But I'm saying this is a dramatic transformation in society over the last 50 to 100 years. And we want that to continue. How did that happen? It went lockstep with an efficient energy system globally, with the mobilisation of labour and women in the workforce was clearly material after the Second World War. But as important, the discoveries of cheap oil, cheap coal, cheap gas, and the transformation of that, both physical and chemical energy, into our society, producing enormous surpluses that enable these transformations to happen. And we get into a really interesting argument then about, let's take this logical conclusion about we've got a belief system of the need to transform our energy system to remove a distant goal. Please don't hear this as a deny. It's not about whether it's right or wrong. It's just about goals. So I'm a lot of economists say long duration. This is where I'm aiming. But to do that, I'm going to have draconian change in my energy system today, which means short term a cost. All that cost is going to be borne today. The problem with that, who really bears that cost? We will probably stagger through it, but who will not are the low and middle income societies that are going through a dramatic transformation. And Václav Smil, if you're interested, and you guys by definition being here are, you may have read it already, he's very divisive, maybe too strong, but their opinions are very different on it. But I find his work really refreshing, very interesting. He wrote a book, Energy and Civilization. One of the points he makes is, if you look at, again, not being simplistic, but keeping it simple, how much energy do human beings really use? I think I alluded to it earlier. In Roman times, he calculates it's about 20 gigajoules a year. And modern Danish society, he's Swede, and don't know if I picked on the Danes. He's not Swede, why did I say that? Something else. Anyway, modern Danish society is, at the time he was writing a couple of years ago, something like 114 gigajoules. So we've gone from 20 to 114. I think UK in the Industrial Revolution, we got up to about 40. Well, again, and America's at 300. And the point he makes is, in terms of, if you define, go back to that wonderful quote, I won't define it, but the wonderful quote from Aristotle about what is the purpose of society and his well-being, yes, effectively. That's why the state exists, to encourage well-beingness. Terrible translation of a really interesting word, eudaimonia, which is the best possible ordering of goodness. No doubt linguists would challenge that, but effectively that's what it is. If we believe that's the order of the state, one of the interesting points he makes is, well, that well-beingness seems to reach a kind of peak at around 100, 120, 150 gigajoules. But the moment you add and go any further, and again, it's not just an opinion. You can see that statistically with life expectancy, suicide rates, even GDP per capita. Ultimately, it works through into the productivity of the society. And I think one of the interesting points there is twofold. Firstly, all this debate about changing the production and the supply. Well, again, as analysts, there's two sides to the coin, right? You've got demand, you've also got supply, you've also got demand. How about a bit more work on the demand side? Shifting the way we consume energy. And then you solve a lot of the pollution problems straight away. So, I mean, that's a thought. Technology, though, is the most wonderful solver of problems. And that raises a really interesting question. But who decides the best technology? Should it be individuals or should it be governments? Now, and again, I throw this out, Oxford University, somebody here, please challenge this. I don't know, but the only example I can see in modern history of successful government-mandated technology is the Manhattan Project. Nuclear bomb. Yeah. I would argue the reason that was successful was it was attempting to solve a very discrete problem, delivering an enormous amount of energy, highly destructively, in an instant. That is a problem. If the government chucks enough resources at, I get why that can be solved by government mandate. But reorganizing the socio-economy of the state and its energy foundations, you're telling me government should pre-select the technologies to do that? How can that work? I don't know, and tell me I'm wrong, but I don't get how, even conceptually, how that can work. That really alarms me. So, what if you then come back to this argument, you're creating a system where I'm going to, by definition, stop the growth of gigajoules per capita because I'm creating an efficient system. I say again, who gets hurt? It ain't going to be the 114 to 300 gigajoules lot. It's going to be the people between 30 and 80 gigajoules per capita who suddenly, because they can't burn the coal or whatever, are only doing 30 or 40 gigajoules. And the difference there in that extra energy is the difference between children living and dying. Without exaggeration, fresh water, stuff like that. All the changes that we've delivered as a society globally, the dramatic change in health globally. There's some amazing facts in this book. I can't remember it very ages ago, but it's something like vaccinations. 90% of the world's children, 90% have had an inoculation. It has to mean that 90% of world children have had access to some kind of healthcare. What a beautiful thing that is. And that would, try that 50 years ago, try that 100 years ago. And again, I cannot sit here and tell us all because of the energy system, but I can say the correlations here are so strong, we have a moral duty to be very careful if we're going to wreck it. Be careful what you wish for. So.
Okay, this is sort of descending from the stratosphere to the mundane, but I was wondering, it seems pretty clear that in the medium term, we need a lot more gas. Kind of So, the next 5, 10, 30 years, we need a lot more gas. Now, are there constraints on the supply of a lot more gas? Not next year, but a few years out. Do you think they're more on the technical side? Just how long it takes to build gas liquefaction plants and so on, fracking, or on the political side that probably there's quite a lot of unexploded gas we get from Iran, but we don't want gas from Iran. Morocco and Algeria are in the so we can't get no time. This kind of thing. Is the gas out there? What's going to hold us back over the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Oh, well, yeah, excellent question. I mean, look, the first thing as analysts, we kind of joke, we never, a bit like weather forecasters. Weather forecasters are pretty good up to about 2-3 weeks, and then it becomes really problematic. And that's speaking to Mess, they will obviously talk about things like that. So also in terms of economic analysts, and certainly commodity analysts, we tend to feel comfortable talking 1-2 years out. Beyond that, the problem is, you tell me what the price of money is, what's the interest rates, how much can I borrow money for, what's the price signal for the commodity, and I can attempt to answer it. What I can say though is two things. Firstly, never bet against the engineers. Those guys are amazing. They're the future, they're the past, they're what kept us going. I mean, I'm not being glib. Why did the world not, why was the energy crisis of 2008 resolved? Because engineers, because fracking. Firstly, we've got engineers, and secondly, I've never read any literature that suggests there's a shortage of hydrocarbons. It's just at what price? That's the question. But there's kind of two things. Can you create a system where we have lots of renewables and we have lots of gas, and on paper that balances? Yeah, I'm sure you could. But ultimately, it does all come down to cost and price. Are we allocating too much of society's resources to do that, therefore impoverishing our society? Because think of it, one analogy I was once given is, think of it as a bicycle. The bicycle is the economy, the hill is the growth trajectory of that society. It's the job of any society to get out that hill. We do that through work. And that pedaling action is simply the work of the society. Now, the gear you're in is the state of the energy system. If you're in the right gear, you can put the right amount of energy allocated into that and the right amount of energy moving forward. But has any of you ever been in the wrong gear going up a hill? When you're pushing, you're putting so much energy into it and you're not moving, worms survive. Falls over, right? It's exactly the same. We need, is there a shortage of molecules? No. Is there a price at which they can be extracted? Yes. The question, though, I still argue, is about the system that we create and the speed with which we create it. And should we try and create it, given failures of mandated creation historically? Are we not, or are we trying to go about this the wrong way? The changes should be on the demand side. There should be discrete changes, a bit like one of the best both energy and environmental policies I ever came across was the UK government with the 5p tax on plastic bags. Whose behaviour has been changed? All of you, right? Use less bags.
Okay. So, conscious of time, just one more question. I saw another question there, but then you can ask later. This is an online question.
Sure.
You kind of have to ask. So this is from Nala. Thanks for your presentation. What are the implications of the new sustainable finance disclosure regulation that also obligate asset managers to disclose ESG characteristics on the energy sector? So what's the effect of that on energy sector, which is already heavily influenced by financial institutions?
Sure. Well, firstly, I'm not a financial analyst, so I'll put that caveat. I guess my answer to that question would be an indirect answer. Do you believe in government mandated flows of money? That's all that is. That's basically saying we're going to lay a layer of cost on the greater good. And is that the most effective way of, well, I'm not sure what it's trying to achieve. I suppose it's shoving even more money into producing the renewables in terms of an allocation. But I think, it's very, what the questioner is certainly highlighting is the approach we're currently taking, which is one of pre-selection of technology and then interference of the flow of capital. And I feel uncomfortable with both of those in terms of delivering a greater good to a greater number. That's a utilitarian argument.
That's right. Thank you so much. Little bit of truth lesson. Should we just thank one more time?